The registration hall on Prometheus Prime buzzed with the controlled chaos of 3,000 scientists, engineers, and researchers from across the galaxy attempting to navigate the Galactic Engineering Symposium's opening day procedures. Dr. Samantha Rivers stood in line behind a group of Centauri mathematicians whose geometric tattoos shifted color as they debated quantum topology, trying to balance her enthusiasm for the week's technical presentations with her dread of the inevitable networking requirements. Next, called the registration android, its cheerful synthetic voice somehow managing to sound both helpful and slightly condescending. Samantha stepped forward, presenting her credentials to the scanning array while glancing around the massive hall. The symposium attracted the best minds from hundreds of worlds, creating a diverse crowd that represented the cutting edge of interspecies scientific collaboration. She spotted familiar faces from previous conferences mixed with exotic beings she'd only read about in xenobiology journals. Dr. Rivers, the android announced, your lodging assignment is Level 7, Section C. Your presentation on neuroprosthetic interfaces is scheduled for Day 3 at 1,400 hours in Auditorium Beta. Thanks, Samantha replied, accepting her identification badge and conference materials. As she moved away from the registration desk, she nearly collided with someone moving in the opposite direction. Excuse me, she said automatically, then stopped as she got her first clear look at the being she'd almost bumped into. The woman, for despite the pale blue skin and hair that seemed to move independently of any breeze, she was definitely humanoid, stood about Samantha's height with features that would have been considered elegant in any species. Her silver hair caught the hall's artificial lighting in ways that suggested it might be composed of something more exotic than normal biological material, and her skin had the kind of translucent quality that reminded Samantha of fine porcelain. No harm done, the woman replied in accented standard, her voice carrying musical undertones that marked her as non-human despite her near-perfect pronunciation. Samantha's scientific curiosity kicked in as she tried to place the woman's species. The pale blue skin and independently mobile hair suggested Nethi's ancestry, but that seemed unlikely given their reputation for avoiding large gatherings. The Nethys were known throughout the galaxy for their extraordinary telepathic abilities, but also for their tendency toward dangerous psychic episodes when exposed to crowds of other sentient beings. First time at the symposium? Samantha asked, partly from politeness and partly from genuine interest in meeting another researcher she didn't recognize. Yes, the woman replied, then paused as if considering whether to elaborate. I am Lyra Kesshai from the Nethys Coalition. I'm here to present research on quantum biological neural networks. Samantha felt her eyebrows rise with interest. Really? I work on neural prosthetics. There might be some interesting overlap between our fields. Lyra's pale skin brightened slightly, shifting toward a more luminous blue that Samantha interpreted as pleasure or excitement. I would very much like to discuss that with you. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the registration desk, where a group of Andromedan physicists were having an animated discussion about conference scheduling. In the distraction, Samantha noticed how other attendees moved around Lyra in subtle but deliberate patterns, maintaining distance without making their avoidance obvious. Dr. Kesshai, Samantha said, using the formal address that seemed appropriate for a first meeting, would you like to grab coffee and talk about neural interface architectures? I saw a decent cafe on level 5. Lyra's expression shifted through several emotions that Samantha couldn't quite interpret, finally settling on what looked like surprised gratitude. That would be wonderful. Thank you. As they made their way through the crowds toward the cafe, Samantha became more aware of the subtle social dynamics playing out around them. Conversations quieted when Lyra passed, then resumed in whispers after she moved beyond hearing range. Other attendees seemed to find urgent reasons to examine their data pads or suddenly remember appointments elsewhere whenever Lyra approached. Is it always like this? Samantha asked as they found seats in the nearly empty cafe. Lyra's skin darkened slightly, shifting toward deeper blues that suggested sadness or resignation. My species has a complicated reputation in academic circles. Most researchers prefer to maintain cautious distance. Because of the telepathic abilities? Because of the incidents, Lyra corrected. A century ago, a Nethys engineer working on a space station suffered what you might call a telepathic breakdown. The psychic trauma affected hundreds of beings. Since then, most species consider us potentially dangerous. Samantha studied Lyra's face, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the careful way she modulated her voice to avoid any hint of telepathic resonance. And you? Are you dangerous? Lyra's laugh was soft but tinged with bitterness. I am a quantum biologist with advanced degrees in consciousness studies and neural architecture. I have spent my entire career developing technology that could revolutionize interspecies communication. But to most beings here, I am simply a potential threat to be managed carefully. They spent the next 2 hours discussing neural interface theory with an intensity that reminded Samantha why she'd chosen research over clinical practice. Lyra's insights into quantum consciousness were brilliant, her approaches to biological computing utterly novel, and her theories about telepathic enhancement of artificial intelligence bordered on revolutionary. This is incredible work, Samantha said, reviewing the technical specifications Lyra had shared on her data pad. Why isn't every cybernetics lab in the galaxy trying to collaborate with you? Lyra's skin shifted through patterns that Samantha was learning to interpret as complex emotions. Because collaboration requires proximity, and proximity with a telepath makes most beings uncomfortable. They worry about mental contamination, loss of privacy, or triggering the kind of breakdown that created our reputation. Have you ever had a breakdown? No, Lyra said quietly. But the fear remained stronger than the evidence. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Samantha found herself looking forward to continuing their conversation during the symposium's technical sessions. She was particularly interested in Lyra's scheduled presentation, which promised to demonstrate practical applications of quantum biological interfaces that could transform her own research directions. It wasn't until the next morning, as she watched attendees carefully avoid the section where Lyra sat alone during the opening ceremonies, that Samantha began to understand the full scope of the isolation that brilliant minds could face when fear overshadowed scientific curiosity. The sight of such obvious exclusion made her feel angry in ways that surprised her with their intensity. Here was someone whose research could benefit every species represented at the symposium, and instead of collaboration, she was receiving the kind of treatment usually reserved for dangerous criminals or contagious diseases. Samantha made a decision that would change both their lives. She was going to make sure Lyra Kesshai felt welcome at this symposium, regardless of what anyone else thought about the risks of associating with a telepathic alien. Lyra's presentation was scheduled for the second day's afternoon session in Auditorium Beta, one of the smaller venues typically reserved for specialized technical topics. Samantha arrived early, expecting to find the hall filled with researchers eager to learn about cutting-edge neural interface technology. Instead, she discovered barely 30 attendees scattered throughout a space designed for 300. Pathetic turnout, muttered Dr. James Park, settling into a seat near the back. Though I suppose it's understandable given the presenter's reputation. Samantha turned to study the sparse audience, recognizing most faces as junior researchers or graduate students who probably couldn't afford to be selective about which sessions they attended. The senior scientists and department heads who should have been most interested in Lyra's work were conspicuously absent. Lyra entered through the presenter's entrance, her silver hair catching the auditorium's lights as she approached the central podium. She wore formal academic robes in deep blue that complemented her pale skin, and she carried herself with the kind of dignity that suggested years of practice at maintaining composure under difficult circumstances. Good afternoon, she began, her musical voice carrying clearly through the nearly empty auditorium. I'm here to discuss the development of quantum biological neural networks and their potential applications for interspecies communication enhancement. What followed was 45 minutes of the most innovative scientific presentation Samantha had attended in years. Lyra's research combined biological neural structures with quantum computing principles, creating hybrid systems that could process consciousness itself as a form of data. The implications were staggering. Direct mind-to-mind communication between species, enhanced cognitive processing for individuals with neurological damage, and the possibility of creating artificial intelligences that truly understood organic thought patterns. But throughout the presentation, attendees continued leaving. Some found excuses during the question periods, others simply gathered their materials and departed without explanation. By the final 15 minutes, fewer than 20 people remained in the auditorium. Are there any questions about the practical implementation of these systems? Lyra asked, her skin shifting toward deeper blues that Samantha recognized as disappointment mixed with resignation. Samantha raised her hand. Dr. Kesai, your work on consciousness modeling could revolutionize neural prosthetics for individuals with spinal cord injuries. Have you considered applications for sensory replacement systems? Lyra's skin brightened immediately, shifting toward luminous silver as she launched into a detailed explanation of how quantum biological interfaces could restore not just motor function but complete sensory experience for paralyzed patients. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Samantha found herself taking extensive notes despite having no official collaboration framework. The biological components naturally adapt to individual neural patterns, Lyra explained, manipulating holographic displays that showed the interface systems at the molecular level. Unlike traditional prosthetics that require the brain to adapt to artificial inputs, these systems learn to communicate in the user's natural cognitive language. When the session ended, the few remaining attendees filed out quickly, leaving Samantha alone with Lyra in the vast, empty auditorium. That was brilliant, Samantha said, approaching the podium where Lyra was packing her presentation materials. Your research could help millions of beings across the galaxy. If anyone were willing to work with a Nethys researcher, Lyra replied, her tone matter-of-fact rather than bitter. But fear is a powerful obstacle to scientific progress. Samantha felt anger building in her chest, the kind of righteous indignation that had driven her to choose research fields that directly helped people rather than purely theoretical work. It's their loss. And it's a loss for everyone who could benefit from your innovations. They walked together toward the auditorium's exit, their conversation flowing naturally from technical details to broader questions about the intersection of consciousness and technology. Samantha found herself genuinely enjoying Lyra's company. The Nethys woman was brilliant, articulate, and possessed a dry sense of humor that emerged once she relaxed enough to let her guard down. Would you like to continue this discussion over dinner? Samantha asked as they reached the main corridor. I know a place that serves decent food and doesn't mind if researchers take over tables for hours with technical diagrams. Lyra's skin shifted through patterns that Samantha was learning to interpret as complex emotions. Dr. Rivers, I appreciate your kindness, but you should understand that association with me may affect how your colleagues view your work. The scientific community has long memories regarding Nethys interactions. Let me worry about my colleagues, Samantha replied. I'm more interested in your insights into consciousness architecture than in what anyone thinks about my dining companions. The restaurant Samantha chose was a small establishment on the station's civilian level, far from the symposium's official venues and the complex social hierarchies of academic politics. They found a corner table surrounded by the comfortable hum of conversation from other diners, creating an atmosphere that felt more like friendship than formal scientific collaboration. Tell me about the telepathic component, Samantha said, reviewing Lyra's research notes on her data pad. Your species' natural abilities must give you insights into consciousness that the rest of us can only theorize about. Lyra was quiet for a moment, her skin cycling through subtle shades that suggested internal debate. Most beings prefer not to discuss the telepathic aspects of my work. They find the concept unsettling. I find it fascinating, Samantha replied honestly. If you're comfortable sharing, I'd love to understand how telepathic perception affects your approach to neural architecture. What followed was a conversation that stretched through the evening and into the station's night cycle, covering everything from the quantum mechanics of consciousness to the ethical implications of mind-to-mind communication. Samantha discovered that Lyra's telepathic abilities, rather than being the dangerous wild talent that rumors suggested, were precisely controlled and primarily focused on understanding the patterns of thought rather than accessing specific mental content. I sense emotional resonance and cognitive structures, Lyra explained, not private thoughts or personal memories. It's more like reading the music of consciousness without hearing the specific words of the song. As they finally prepared to leave the restaurant, Samantha realized that her decision to attend Lyra's presentation had led to the most intellectually stimulating conversation she'd had in months, possibly years. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, echoing the casual way friends made plans to continue enjoying each other's company. Lyra's smile was radiant, her skin glowing with patterns that needed no interpretation. "I would like that very much." The networking luncheon on the symposium's final day took place in Station Hall Alpha, a vast space designed to accommodate hundreds of researchers in an environment that encouraged interdisciplinary collaboration. Round tables filled the area, each one seating 8 participants in configurations meant to foster the kind of casual conversation that led to breakthrough partnerships and innovative joint projects. Samantha arrived with her meal tray to find the hall buzzing with animated discussions about funding opportunities, research collaborations, and the technical presentations that had defined the week's sessions. The energy was infectious. This was where real scientific progress happened, in the informal exchanges between brilliant minds who recognized mutual interests and complementary expertise. It took her several minutes to locate Lyra among the crowds, partly because she was scanning for the distinctive silver hair and blue skin, but mostly because she was looking for someone sitting with colleagues rather than sitting alone. When she finally spotted Lyra, Samantha felt a familiar surge of anger at the casual cruelty of academic social dynamics. Lyra sat at a table for 8 in the center of the hall, her meal barely touched as she stared out the observation windows at the nebula beyond. The 7 empty chairs around her created an invisible barrier that other attendees navigated unconsciously, their conversations flowing around her isolation like water around a stone. Samantha watched from across the hall as researchers approached nearby tables, clustering around discussions of joint funding proposals and collaborative research opportunities. She observed colleagues she'd known for years, intelligent and supposedly enlightened individuals, actively avoiding the table where one of the symposium's most innovative presenters sat alone. Dr. Rivers, Professor Lisa Valdez appeared at her elbow, balancing a tray loaded with what appeared to be Andromedan fusion cuisine. "Excellent presentation yesterday on neural mapping techniques. Are you planning to apply for the Institute grant cycle?" "Thanks," Samantha replied absently, her attention still focused on Lyra's isolated table. "Lisa, what do you know about Nethi's research capabilities?" Professor Valdez followed her gaze, her expression shifting to uncomfortable recognition. "Ah. You mean Dr. Keshai's work. Brilliant stuff, theoretically, but you know how it is with telepathic species. Too much risk for most collaborative frameworks." "What risk, specifically?" Samantha pressed. Her research could advance neural interface technology by decades. "The telepathic contamination issue," Valdez explained, as if discussing a well-established scientific principle. "Extended contact with Nethi's individuals can affect non-telepathic nervous systems in unpredictable ways. Most institutions have policies against close collaboration without extensive safety protocols." Samantha stared at her colleague, a woman whose own research focused on consciousness studies and who should have understood the difference between evidence-based caution and prejudice disguised as scientific concern. "Have you read the actual medical literature on Nethi's telepathic effects?" "Well, no," Valdez admitted. "But the institutional guidelines are quite clear about maintaining appropriate distance." "The institutional guidelines are based on a single incident from a century ago," Samantha said, her voice carrying an edge that made Valdez step back slightly. "One individual's breakdown, extrapolated into species-wide discrimination." She left Valdez standing there and walked deliberately across the crowded hall, her tray balanced in one hand while her data pad rested in the other. Conversations faltered as she passed, other researchers registering her trajectory toward the isolated table with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Samantha reached the empty table where Lyra sat in her bubble of enforced solitude, pulled out the chair directly beside her, and settled into it with the kind of casual decisiveness that brooked no argument. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, though she was already arranging her meal and data pad on the table surface. Lyra looked up with startled eyes, her pale skin brightening to nearly white with what Samantha interpreted as shock mixed with hope. "Dr. Rivers, you don't have to. I want to hear more about your neural network architectures," Samantha interrupted with a smile that she hoped conveyed genuine interest rather than pity. "And I figure the best way to do that is to sit close enough for actual conversation instead of shouting across an empty table." The effect on the surrounding area was immediate and dramatic. Conversations at nearby tables stumbled as attendees registered the unprecedented sight of someone voluntarily sitting with the Nethy's representative. Samantha could feel curious gazes and hear whispered exchanges that probably involved speculation about her sanity or her career prospects. "Are you certain this is wise?" Lyra asked quietly, her skin cycling through patterns that suggested anxiety mixed with gratitude. "Association with me may affect how your colleagues view your research." "My colleagues can view my research based on its merit," Samantha replied, pulling up technical diagrams on her data pad. "Now, tell me about the quantum consciousness modeling you mentioned yesterday. I think there might be applications for sensory replacement systems that neither of us has considered." As they dove into technical discussion, Samantha noticed that Lyra's telepathic abilities, rather than being the dangerous wild talent that rumors suggested, actually enhanced their communication. Lyra seemed to sense when Samantha needed clarification on unfamiliar concepts or when she was genuinely excited about a particular research direction, allowing their conversation to flow with unusual efficiency and depth. The biological components naturally interface with existing neural pathways, Lyra explained, her enthusiasm growing as she realized Samantha was following the complex theoretical framework. Unlike traditional prosthetics that require the brain to learn new input methods, quantum biological systems adapt to each individual's cognitive patterns. "So instead of teaching the brain to understand artificial signals," Samantha said, "you're creating artificial systems that speak the brain's natural language." "Exactly," Lyra's skin practically glowed with excitement. "And with telepathic enhancement, the adaptation process could be guided rather than random, reducing training time from months to days." Their animated discussion began attracting attention from nearby tables, though Samantha noticed that other researchers seemed curious about their technical exchange despite their apparent reluctance to approach a Nethys directly. Dr. Rivers, Dr. James Park appeared at their table, his expression carefully neutral. "I couldn't help overhearing your discussion of neural adaptation protocols. We've been working on similar challenges in our artificial consciousness lab." Samantha gestured to an empty chair. "Dr. Park, meet Dr. Lyra Kesai. I think you two might find some interesting overlap in your research approaches." As Dr. Park hesitantly joined their table, followed gradually by other researchers drawn by the innovative ideas emerging from their collaboration, Samantha realized that her simple choice to sit beside someone who needed company was creating ripple effects throughout the symposium's social dynamics. Fear, it seemed, was most effectively countered not by arguments or evidence, but by the simple demonstration that connection was possible without catastrophe. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but by the symposium's final sessions, the careful social barriers that had isolated Lyra were beginning to crumble. What started with Dr. Park's hesitant joining of their lunch conversation evolved into a growing cluster of researchers who discovered that their fears of telepathic contamination were vastly overblown compared to the benefits of collaborating with someone whose insights into consciousness were genuinely revolutionary. "I have to admit," Professor Valdez said during the closing reception, "I may have been operating on outdated assumptions about Nethys interactions. Dr. Kesai's work on neural adaptation could solve problems we've been struggling with for years." Samantha smiled, watching Lyra across the reception hall as she engaged in animated conversation with a group of cybernetic specialists who had initially avoided her presentations. Her pale blue skin glowed with patterns that Samantha now recognized as genuine happiness, a far cry from the resigned isolation she'd displayed during the symposium's opening days. "Turns out telepaths make excellent research partners," Samantha replied. "Who would have thought that being able to sense when someone doesn't understand a concept would improve scientific communication?" The week's final event was the presentation of collaborative proposals, where research teams outlined joint projects that had emerged from the symposium's networking opportunities. Samantha stood at the podium beside Lyra, facing an audience that included funding representatives from major institutions across the galaxy. Our proposal combines human cybernetic technology with Nethi's quantum biological interfaces, Samantha announced, creating neural enhancement systems that maintain individual mental autonomy while enabling direct consciousness communication between species. Lyra stepped forward, her confidence a marked contrast to the nervous isolation she'd displayed just days earlier. The telepathic component serves as a guidance system for neural adaptation, reducing the training period for consciousness interfaces from months to days while ensuring compatibility with each individual's unique cognitive patterns. The questions that followed were technical rather than fearful, focused on implementation challenges and potential applications rather than safety concerns about working with telepathic beings. Dr. Park asked about scalability for artificial consciousness research. Professor Valdez inquired about applications for treating degenerative neural conditions. Even the funding representatives seemed more interested in timeline projections than risk assessments. Dr. Kesai asked Dr. Elena Santos from the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies, would you consider a permanent research position that would allow you to develop these concepts in a fully equipped laboratory environment? Lyra's skin shifted through patterns that Samantha had learned indicated surprise mixed with carefully controlled hope. I would need to discuss such an opportunity with my government, but yes, I would be very interested. And Dr. Rivers, Dr. Santos continued, we'd like to offer you the position of project director for the Interspecies Neural Interface Initiative. The role would involve coordinating research teams from multiple species and overseeing the development of consciousness enhancement technologies. Samantha felt a flutter of excitement that had nothing to do with career advancement and everything to do with the prospect of continuing her collaboration with someone whose mind complemented her own in ways she was still discovering. 6 months later, their laboratory on Titan hummed with the productive energy of a research team that had learned to value diverse perspectives over comfortable familiarity. The Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies had become a model for interspecies scientific collaboration, its success built on the foundation of researchers who chose curiosity over fear. Neural Integration Test Number 43, Samantha announced, monitoring the holographic displays that showed a volunteer's brain activity as they interfaced with one of Lyra's quantum biological neural networks. All cognitive functions nominal, consciousness transfer at 96% efficiency. Lyra smiled from her position at the telepathic monitoring station, her skin glowing with the silver patterns that had become associated with successful experiments. The subject reports complete sensory restoration with no discomfort or adaptation period. The biological components have achieved perfect integration with existing neural pathways. Their breakthrough technology had already helped hundreds of beings recover from neurological injuries, created the first successful artificial intelligence that truly understood organic thought patterns, and established communication protocols that allowed telepathic and non-telepathic species to collaborate without fear or misunderstanding. Remember when you thought I might be dangerous? Lyra asked during their evening break, settling into the laboratory's comfortable seating area where they often continued their discussions long after official working hours. I remember thinking you looked lonely, Samantha corrected, reviewing the day's test results on her data pad. And I remember deciding that brilliant minds shouldn't have to work in isolation just because other people are afraid of what they don't understand. Lyra's expression softened, her skin shifting to warm blues that Samantha had learned indicated deep affection and gratitude. That decision changed everything for me. Not just my research opportunities, but my understanding of what friendship could mean across species boundaries. Best decision I made that week, Samantha agreed, then paused as she reviewed their latest funding proposal. Speaking of decisions, the Institute wants to expand our research into full consciousness transfer protocols. They're offering us a permanent facility and unlimited research budget. And the chance to prove that some of the most profound scientific advances come from choosing connection over comfort, Lyra added, her smile brightening the laboratory's artificial lighting. As they worked late into the station's night cycle, Surrounded by the gentle hum of quantum biological processors and the soft glow of consciousness mapping displays, Samantha reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple choice to sit beside someone who needed company. The scientific community had learned that fear of the unknown was a poor substitute for evidence-based collaboration, while she had discovered that the most rewarding partnerships often began with nothing more complex than choosing to offer friendship when everyone else chose distance. Their research would help countless beings across the galaxy, but the real breakthrough had been simpler and more profound, proving that consciousness recognized kinship across any barrier of species, culture, or reputation, and that sometimes the most important discoveries happen not in laboratories but in the moment when someone decided that another person's isolation was unacceptable. The Galactic Science Foundation's award ceremony 6 months later would recognize their technological innovations and their contributions to interspecies understanding, but Samantha knew that their greatest achievement would always be the friendship that had grown from her decision to pull out a chair and sit down beside someone who had been waiting far too long for someone to choose connection over comfort.